Being
Three students.
Yeah, it's like being judged.
Okay, well, this is the panel on software management for large digital archives. We have as panelists Jack Cushman, a fellow at the Harvard Library Innovation Lab. The Innovation Lab operates Perma.cc and the Free the Law Project to digitize US case law. Then we have Fang. He is the Assistant Dean for Information Technology and Head of Digital Services at Rutgers Law Library. Rutgers Law Library operates a digital library of primary law for New Jersey, and the online catalog is run in COA open source software. Then we have Sylvia Kwakye. She is tech systems developer at the Legal Information Institute at Cornell. The LII provides access to the US Code and Code of Federal Regulations to 30 million people per year. Today we'll talk about software management. We're now in a world where print is no longer a given and probably not the primary thing libraries will be keeping. So looking into the future, digital content that libraries control will probably be what we have. Like whatever libraries control now is what we'll have in the future. And we have a world where we're gonna have to take that content into the future. This panel will look at managing content and code and the issues around that. So, and feel free to jump in with questions and comments. So the first question is, how do you document your software and systems so multiple people can work together?
Sure. So I kind of had to laugh because that's more something that we wish we did than something that we do. And I'm sure that's true for most projects of our size. Perma.cc is a project we have that does have a few different developers working on it at one time and has had developers come on and leave and does occasionally have outside contributions. For that, we have a startup doc that people can follow to download our software and start running it and set up their developer environment. And what we tend to do is to give them no guidance about how to do that. So say, go to the repo, follow the instructions, let us know where you get, and then find out what problems they hit and correct those in the documentation. So that's our effort towards hoping that the documentation stays up to date. I would say that we don't have enough turnover on the team that strategy on its own is totally effective. There's a lot of room for drift if you wait 6 months or a year before finding out if your install instructions still work. So it doesn't feel like a totally solved problem to me. And even less so with the sort of many side projects that we tend to pick up where you might only have one developer or two who really knows how the whole system works. I think the state right now is that a lot of things live in our heads, and we have what they call it the bus factor, the kind of who on your team could get hit by a bus and then you'd be in trouble. And our bus factor is, there's a number of people who, if they were hit by a bus, we would have real problems. So I'm looking forward to kind of a much more encouraging answer down the line.
Hopefully. Well, I'm also working for the law school's IT perspective in addition to the law library projects. So in IT, we do things a little bit differently than we do in the library. In IT, we rely on a tool from Dell called CASE, K-A-C-E, and that one is actually a ticketing system, but it has a built-in knowledge-based management system too. So whenever we encounter an interaction with end users, we just document the interaction, and later on we can retrieve it that way. For coding, we do inline. We rely on inline comment type of coding too. But we have a network-attached storage device that stores our documentation too. But that one, we keep having problem because we have to bear in mind that we have to maintain, keep updating the documents so it's up to date. So if a project's lasting like 10, 15 years, we will have a lot of trouble keep on tracking those things. And it may mislead in some sense. For the NJ Law collection, I kind of defer that to my director, John Jorgensen, sitting over there. He will just give you a better sense. Yeah? The NJ Law. The NJ Law documentation. What kind of documentation?
It's an old system. So it's people who are coders who could a problem because in order to get
I would say we have a similar problem to what you also have in that our team is very small. So it's very easy to turn to the other person and say, I'm working on XYZ, can you help me with this or that? So that's how we used to collaborate. We have a very famous story about one of our developers who recently retired, who was famously not forthcoming with talking about whatever he was working on. So our associate director for technology, Sarah, would take him out every week, and they'll buy the biggest, most decadent muffin there was in the cafe, split it, and then spend 2 hours talking about code and how it worked and everything. But in the last year or so, we've taken a stab at documenting a lot of the things that we do. We moved our version control system over to GitLab. So we have one on GitLab and we have one on GitHub. So GitHub is for when we work with students. Various student projects are documented in GitHub, and we encourage them to write reports every week on whatever piece of work that they accomplished so that we can keep up. We put a restriction on the length of the reports that they write so that they actually get read. You know, lengthy reports don't get read. And in GitLab, we are also making an attempt to document what we're doing. It's famously hard to get developers in general to write documentation about what they're doing. So as you said, if you comment the code or you write very chatty code, then anyone else who runs your code can see what is going on. So those are some of the ways that we've been working at mitigating the problem. And also there's Google Docs, you know, where you could put something up and invite others to comment on it. And one of the reasons why we started doing this is that I'm relatively new to the LII. I started almost, not quite 2 years ago. And so I kept asking, where is XYZ? What does XYZ, you know? And so that helped the process along.
Could I add a couple responses to that?
Me too.
Yeah. We try to do everything that we can do in a public GitHub repository. So if we have any kind of choice, we'll make it public, and we'll also use the GitHub issue tracker to have conversations about features that we're thinking of adding or bugs that we're aware of. So there ends up being some good public documentation of the kinds of policy debates we've had and the kind of problems we've had to solve. And I think that's probably the best source of documentation for the project is the conversation we've had on GitHub. The other thing that we do for Perma is a code review process, which we try to keep very lightweight, but if I'm going to make a change to the code, I send a pull request and one of the other two developers will just read through it and click, okay, yeah, let's merge it. Mm-hmm. And that at least means that one other person knows more or less what I've done. And if I'm doing code review and I see a piece I don't understand, I'll kind of comment, I don't get why we're doing this. Can we write it more simply? Or can you add a comment to explain why we can't write it more simply and what it does? So having like at least two people, you know, looking at each line has some value. I'm curious if other people have tried that and how it's gone, because the downside becomes maybe I'm thinking about this today and my coworker isn't going to look at it for 2 days, and by then I'm not thinking about it anymore. So it adds a little bit of friction too.
Yeah.
Generally, we don't do comprehensive code reviews because usually one person has a responsibility for a certain area or a certain feature. And so the only time another person might comment on the code itself is, as you said, if maybe the out of curiosity, they took a look and they didn't understand something or something broke in the running of that code, then they would, you know, make a point to say something about it. But in general, you're responsible for your domain and keeping it clean and documented. And we also use Trello to make a list of what we're working on. You know, you can also have a wish list of what you're working on. You could have a I need help on this list so that someone can take a look at whatever it is that you're working on. And we have, we have an integration between GitLab and Trello so that some of the work that you're doing shows up in Trello, which everybody in the group is up on. And also Slack as well. It's also wired into Slack. So it passes by. If you want to look, you look.
We do Slack too.
Yeah.
When we have interactions with other departments. We also have our own SVN server for tracking different versions throughout our system. We don't rely on GitHub because it's just a little bit too much for us for the purpose that we do. Okay. We also use Basecamp when we collaborate with other departments. You know, we have in my school it's fairly large, so we occasionally have to work with telecommunication division, and we have to work with central IT office to get their inputs. So we rely on Basecamp to do that type of collaboration.
Do you have any content that you think will still be around in 30 years? And what's the biggest danger to maintaining your digital content over long time periods?
I guess I can answer that. I've been in the field for like 10-some years, so I know I ran into at least one occasion where one format is kind of outdated, and we are kind of have to figure out a way to convert that. But fortunately for us, in our case, we also, the particular format I'm referring to is called Deja Vu. I don't know if anyone here using that. That's the reason. Yeah, anyhow, back to 10 years ago, it was kind of a direct competitor to PDF format. Mm-hmm. So back then, what we were doing was we create the text file first, and based on the text file, we scan images, right? Then we create the text file. And based on the text file, we convert the text file into PDF and Deja Vu. Because back then, we were kind of put our feet on two boats. You know, we don't know which one will be the winner, PDF or Deja Vu. So, well, right now it turns out PDF won, so we have to think about what we are going to do with the fairly large Deja Vu collection we have in-house. Unfortunately, it's kind of fading out, so there's really no plugin, no viewer that are up to date. You know, it just kind of gets stuck there. But we can always convert PDF into other formats. Another thing is I'm also running a digital video collection for a Supreme Court oral argument. So in the past, we started this project in 2003 and 2004, and we started with WMV format. And the procedure back then was once we got the original video downloaded and converted in low resolution and mid bandwidth resolution, we just get rid of the original video. So right now we stuck with a collection, you know, that is in low resolution compared to current standards. And yeah, I mean, and then right now we just finished a project where we converted WMV format into MP4 format. But if you are thinking 30 years down the road, right now maybe WebM will be another successor to MP4, and nobody really knows. So we just keep the original file that we downloaded from Supreme Court just in case.
Next year, the LII would have been around for 25 years. So I would say that as long as we have data sources for primary laws, we are going to be publishing them. There's a huge personal commitment on the part of pretty much everyone in the organization to make law freely available and easily understood. And so we'll just work our way adapting each format as it comes. So we started out with plain text, it went to bell code format, HTML, XML, adapt as we go along. And so the biggest danger I would say, to our operations would be mainly stuff that is completely out of our control. For instance, say our data sources suddenly acquire some editorial content which now makes them copyrightable so that they're no longer accessible to us. That would be a danger. As I said, right now we just rely on freely available sources from, say, GPO or Office OLRC. But if those sources become restricted, then that would be a problem for us. That would be the main danger, I would say. Other than that, our mission is fairly clear, and we intend to carry on as long as there are people to carry on.
So we have a few different projects that are generating large data sets that we need to be around for a very long time. And I think they pose different challenges. One of them is Perma.cc, which is for fixing link rot. And so we're used by courts. We just had our first published citation from the Washington State Supreme Court. And so a court, when it publishes an opinion and it links to a URL, will include a short URL that goes to a copy that's held by the Harvard Law Library. And as we go forward, we'll share it with other law libraries around the world. And our commitment to courts is that link is going to keep working as long as people care to read your case and know why you decided the way you decided. So it really is a problem if we lose track of the data later. So that's one problem, keeping web archives intact for the long term and accessible for the long term. A second project is our case law scanning project. We've been calling it Free the Law, and unfortunately launched very close in time to the Free Law Project, which is doing amazing work and which we don't wish to compete with. So I believe we'll be calling that the Case Law Transformation Project going forward, just to set the record straight. Anyway, our case law scanning project is going to result in 40 million scanned pages of US case law and an equivalent amount of structured XML data, which we hope to be the definitive authoritative ground truth for this is what courts have published in books up until 2015. And so we hope that going forward, people will be able to refer back to that ground truth and that we'll be able to improve the ways that it is incomplete. And so again, it would be a shame if 20 years from now we lost track of it or it was no longer accessible. We will be keeping the paper wrapped in shrink wrap in a vault, but it would just be pretty awful to have to go back to scan that again and recreate the effort that's been made in turning it into useful data. So that's problem two, is how do we keep this ground truth state of the US published case law intact and accessible going forward. A third one, which is a project that I worked on starting about a year ago and that I think may find some new applications soon, is what we call strong dark archives. So the problem of when you have very sensitive cultural materials that a library might make a commitment to keep private for 40 or 50 years, but that there will be outside pressure to make public earlier or to steal. And so a way to take those materials and split them among a group of libraries so that any 3 out of 5 can determine that the release conditions have been met and share it. But if you have fewer than 3, you can't share it at all. The individual shard that one library holds is not readable. So there you have the problem of, we have this chunk of data that right now is utterly meaningless. Any individual shard can't be read, but someone cares very much that 40 years from now we can assemble 3 of those and turn them back into legible data. So it's a third kind of problem of maintaining those shards. So I think a lot about kind of the fear of, what if one way or another we bobble our commitment to maintain some ongoing data source. One one of the lead figures who I look to in thinking about that is David Rosenthal of the LOX project, Lots of Copies Keep Stuff Safe. His blog, if you look back through it, is a deep source of wisdom for how to think about keeping data for the long term. And his writing looks at kind of the many threats to a data set over time. So there is the kind of, the bits could rot in your hard drive. And he says, number one, consider that to be more likely than you think it is for the amount of data you have and the amount of time you care about it. But also, the bits could be attacked by an outside attacker. Also, your institution could lose funding. Also, it could turn out that you forget what it is and then no one thinks to look for it. And he enumerates, another 5 or something, types of threats that your data could face. That was what motivated the Lots of Copies Keep Stuff Safe project, in the principle that no one institution can mitigate all of those threats reliably over 50 years. If we're undertaking to store digital data for the time span that we've stored physical things, we have to share that burden. And I'm in a library that has books, paper books, going back to before the printing press, kind of tucked away. And I love that we have those, that we've been able to achieve that. I think that we should achieve the same thing with data, but we haven't proved that we can yet, and we haven't faced all of the challenges that we're going to face in trying to do it, and we can't, and I think David says this convincingly, we can't simply write it to some reliable physical medium. There's too much of it that's valuable, and the media that we would write to haven't had time to prove themselves. Before I kind of keep babbling, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I wanted to, number one, just
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
the other thing, and do the program will take about a week.
Yeah.
Because the metadata store and the actual object.
So LOX in particular, that software from the Stanford project, is what we're planning to use right now for the distributed storage of Perma archives. One of the things I would call out as being a benefit of that particular software over other sort of more recently created distributed storage software is that part of the threat model is of any particular institution failing. So institutions like Facebook and Red Hat are making awesome modern distributed storage tools, but they don't usually have the model that Facebook itself might cease to exist. Usually that threat is outside the concern of the distributed system that's storing the data. LOX is built with the understanding that any one of the institutions that's holding a copy might cease to exist or might become even hostile to the existence of the data, and that should be okay for the other nodes. Another thing I'd throw in about storage and metadata, for Perma, when we store web archives, we use the ISO standard WARC format, W-A-R-C, which is modeled after, similar to the HTTP headers format. So if you just open a WARC in a text editor, you kind of see the metadata headers, and then the actual sort of request and response for a web page, and then the actual data, and then another object. You can make great sense of it right out of a text editor. So if you need a format for conglomerating a bunch of files into a single blob with great metadata inside it, I think WARC is worth looking at even if you're not storing web archives, which is what we're doing. So should I just kind of keep going, or cut me off if I...
It's fine. Anyone can ask questions too.
So with Perma, I think that the locks and web archives on the back-end preservation is what we're currently placing our chips on. There's a whole separate thing of how do you keep ongoing access to it. Right now we're kind of going in on the cloud, just kind of keep it up online using Amazon, and if Amazon disappears, we'll need a new plan. So we try to build software that could happily be moved from one host to another, but we're not trying to, on any given day, have multiple hosts for it because of the resources that would take. Another kind of breadcrumb trail for access to web archives that I think is really interesting is the work of Ilya Kramer at Rhizome, who's one of our summer fellows. He's built a product called, a website, oldweb.today. And if you go to oldweb.today, this will be your favorite takeaway from this session. It lets you browse the web at a point in time in the past using the browser that was popular at that point of time in the past. So you can say, I want to browse the web in 2001 using Firefox 4 or whatever, IE 6, and it runs it in a virtual machine there in your browser, and you can see the web at that time. So emulation is one important strategy that way down the road I think we might end up turning to keep our old archives working.
For open source software, what's the balance of development between the bigger open source community outside of your organization and then between people inside of your organization? And what factors determine how much you customize? So if you don't customize at all, you customize a little, customize a lot, or just completely code your own tool?
It really depends. I mean, it depends on the specific project. For instance, the video archive project that I was talking about, we pretty much do our own coding. We also, roughly 5 years ago, we also awarded for a federal grant where we use a DSpace, But anyhow, we used a digital repository called DSpace, and DSpace is Java-based, and I don't have much expertise in Java environment, but I was able to tweak it a little bit to finish the project. But thinking back, I may pick another repository, another open source repository, or just code myself.
Generally, it's not a dogmatic preference, but we generally prefer to use an open source solution if we can find one. If we cannot, we're not opposed to using a commercial solution, but the problem with using a commercial solution is that you might get locked into some format where you cannot retrieve what you need. And so even if we do look at a commercial solution, it has to be one that also supports open formats. So an example, for instance, would be, we don't use Neo4j, for instance. We use GraphDB, which is a commercial database for a triple store for storing it's a graphical database for storing metadata about various documents, various relationships, various links. For instance, we heard a little bit about citations earlier on today. That is a place where we store information about how citations are connected to each other, what links to me, what do I link to, that sort of thing. So that's a commercial solution, and it works because triples are an open format, RDF is an open format, so we are not locked into that solution. But where we cannot find a solution, we'll code our own. But as I said, generally we will first try and see what the state of the technology is and pick up a solution that we can adapt to our purposes first.
I feel like this is one of the like the core skills that it takes the longest to develop as a programmer, like the selection of a tool. Like you're going to have 10 options that are all bad, and you're going to pick one, and then which regrets you're going to have later.
Right.
It seems like the hardest thing to teach, and maybe even to know if you've learned it. I think that philosophically, the way I would think about it is, our job as a lab is to offer some unique value. That if a commercial entity is going to build the thing that we're going to build, we shouldn't be doing it. If there's an off-the-shelf thing you can get and install, probably we shouldn't be doing that either for where we are. So if it's kind of the core thing that we're adding some new value to the world that no one else is going to add, that probably means that we do have to be programming it ourselves. But if it's a tangential thing, then we shouldn't be spending our time on it because we should be rewriting towards the thing that's really core. So I think philosophically, it's like knowing what unique value we're bringing versus when we're duplicating something that someone else has already done well is the hard skill, and then doing it in practice. I wouldn't know how to.
No duplication. We don't like to duplicate. It's frustrating.
Should we talk about the kind of the running the open source side of things too? I mean, only really from the perspective of like our stuff is nominally open source. We put it on GitHub. We put up an MIT license usually. We invite contributions. For the most part, nothing comes. And so the balance as software developers becomes how much do we like write things that are specific to our instance of the application, given that we don't think there's many people other than us running it, but we want to invite them to do it if they choose to. So that feels like the tension when we're publishing open source software. We do also make an effort to push changes up the stack. So if I'm using Python libraries and I have to jump into the library and make changes to get it to work, then I might temporarily have our app run in reference to my copy of the library, but also send a pull request to try to get it back into the trunk. So I feel like that's a way that we can contribute back to the community, looking for when we can offer changes to upstream open source projects.
And there have been instances also where we've used tools that have not worked very well for legal text. For instance, the Stanford parser. Then we would, make it a point to contact the people who maintain it to say, this did not work or it broke in these specific ways. Is there something you could do about it? If we can fix it for our own purposes, we would, but usually we try to contact a developer first to see if they would be willing to work with us to fix it. And we're also lucky enough to be at Cornell University where some of the tools that we use have been developed by people who work there. So Mallet, for instance, which is a topic modeling tool, was developed by a professor who currently works at Cornell. So if we're where we were running into issues of scaling and whatnot, we could directly go to him and his postdocs and say, these are the problems that we're having, can we help you solve them? So that we could use the tool too. So that is another way in which we contribute.
The other thing, I think there's a lot of value to contributing documentation or like where you got confused back upstream. We haven't had a lot of opportunity to do that, but I think like when we're adopting something like locks, I hope we'll be able to send a lot of like, here was a set of things I had to do that weren't quite like the set of things that I thought I was going to have to do.
Actually, I think documentation is much more important than people may think, because especially true in open source software, because I ran into several cases where I was trying to adapt one open source solution for my purpose, but before I go in there, I just read the documentation, and they normally are poorly written, hard to follow, and there's no one to talk to. So I just end up not using that particular software. It's fantastic in the white paper.
How did your organization or you get involved in managing software?
All right, I started as the digital services librarian 10 years ago. So I was doing website management, and I also doing digital library. I construct different digital library stuff. After a few years, I started working on a bigger scale, of the digital library. After we were awarded for a federal grant, so that's where I got the stuff started. And then John came and joined the team. So Now he's mainly managing and creating merged to the IT part of it. Because I also manage the IT operations of the law school. So in IT office, we have roughly 10, 15 websites for different legal centers of the law school. I manage that, and we have some other web-based services. I also manage that. I got involved.
I personally got involved because I was a lawyer working in Boston, and I had a civil case that went on for like a year, and I started looking for alternatives. I went to the open house at the Berkman Center and found the Perma project and incessantly sent them emails and came to their meetings and filed GitHub issues until they agreed to hire me. I think the Library Innovation Lab itself has existed a little longer than I've been there. Thanks to John Palfrey and Jonathan Zittrain and David Weinberger, a number of folks who decided to gamble on something that is as much about the future of what we do as the present of what we do, and as much about the needs of the world as the needs of our local constituents, and to really defend vocally the need to think beyond our local constituents and beyond this year's needs. And it's been working enough that we get to keep doing it.
I first encountered the LII when I was a student at Cornell University, which was in around 2000, the year 2000. I was looking for a capstone project for my minor in CS. I was doing a PhD at the time in bioengineering, nothing to do with the law or anything, but I was looking for a capstone project for my CS minor, and so at the time, Tom Bruce, who's currently the director of the LII, put out, here's a project, who's interested? You know, he was looking for students to work with him, and so jumped on board that, and we did the first conversion of the US code from plain text to XML. I enjoyed the project, and I asked him if I could stay on and work for him while I was still a student. So I worked for the LII until I graduated, went away, and then came back about a year and a half ago. Was on the job market again looking for something to do. I sent an email and I said, you have any interesting projects around? And he just happened to have, the US code they were receiving bulk releases of US code in a new XML format. And so he said, this is your baby from before, why don't you try updating our collection for us? So I started working on that, and that's how I ended up again at the LII. The LII itself has been around, as I mentioned before, for almost 25 years, and it started with Professor Peter Martin and current director Tom Bruce. They just felt very strongly that the law needed to be free, so strongly that Tom Bruce actually wrote a browser, the first browser for Microsoft, so that they could put this stuff out and people could browse and get to the information. And it's continued since then. Many ups and downs, but it's adapted as it's grown. You know, basically, as long as they can get their hands on source data, they would clean it up and make it available. So that's LII through the years.
Are there any questions from the audience?
Raise that phrase of threat model, and then talk about cadre of people who cared about that. I mean, catalogers, programmers. Yay for programmers, but again, catalogers always approach things in a different way. But are we losing that group of people? Programmers and the developers and all that kind of stuff. And maybe your institutions out in the provinces, you know, catalogers do very little cataloging anymore, and I know it's If anybody kind of has any thoughts about that piece that I think is.
We went through a search process for a new director of the library recently, and that was one of the sort of key questions that came from the staff is, how do you feel about recognizing the ongoing importance of catalogers? I think there is the concern that it's an important, difficult skill that might be undervalued in today's library world. I think one of the jobs, if you're innovating in libraries, is to think about how those deep, important skills will translate into new arenas. So we were kicking around yesterday. Let's say we have all this case law digitized, and then someone comes along and says, I found a bunch of errors. I want you to import this set of changes. How do we express to people who are consuming the data, like that was version 1.2, is this version 1.2.1, or is this version 1.3, depending who's using it and how they think about the changes that we're making. The problem of managing a digital repository over time, we think is going to involve a lot of the same skills. So we're looking for those kinds of the new problems that we can see coming up in the future that are going to require skills that might be undervalued at this moment in time, and how we can bridge that.
Whereas we've relied also on very passionate users who make it a point to tell us where we're lacking in those areas, you know. So I can't speak very much to it, but in my experience, usually when we're doing something wrong in terms of categorizing things, we hear about it and try to fix it. That's.
Well, in my school, we were kind of, I think we are in a better shape because whomever doing coding in my library, they are librarians first, so they do have required master degree, a library degree at first place, and then kind of get semi-trained to do programming. So they have the library skill at first, programming skill at second.
Right.
So there is really not much missing piece in my situation. My background is computer science and plus library. That's why I'm now here.
Yeah. There are many times when I've had a question at the help desk and I've had to just run down to the library to go and ask for help from somebody. Okay, what is this? I don't understand what they're asking for. How do I craft a solution? So my head is in, okay, how do I write a piece of code that would do this on a huge level for across the corpus, you know? But maybe there's this little particular citation or something small that needs to be categorized in a certain way, you know, but I cannot see to that granular level. In that case, I just have to, as I said, run down to the library and ask someone for help. And also, we are lucky in that we have somebody who is a trained librarian also on the help desk. And so a lot of the times before a problem will get to me, she's reinterpreted it in a way that I can understand. And then when I kick up a solution, she can also reinterpret it to the person who had the problem in the first place. So there is some tension there, and we just have to figure out how to work it out. But for right now, we don't have solid answers, I'm afraid.
Slightly different ways, and
There are standards coming out like the Acoma and Tosso standard, for instance, which is really big on generating and keeping metadata with your documents in a way that is traceable. So that is also another think about it. That if it's part of the standard, then this is just something that you have to do. Yeah.
Big archives question. Us too. So, how is provenance and digital preservation different for law libraries and law versus libraries and technology? Okay. Provenance, like the history of a file, like how does it matter more for law and legal documents, or is the same kind of issue as for me?
Imagine that it would matter more for law, whereas for technology, you're looking at the latest thing.
I'm the wrong person on our team to answer that. I'm looking forward to seeing how it collides when we start to discover whether something like GitHub is a better way to track changes in a collection versus systems that are developed for tracking changes in collections but not for digital data. Like, I think we're going to kind of both learn from each other, but I haven't.
Are there questions from the audience?
Raining, it's nap time.
Thank you.
Question.
So I think I can channel David Rosenthal's answer, which is a signature can tell you if you've lost something, but not what you've lost. And then once you know that you've lost something, then you have to have multiple copies to figure out who's right.
And by extension, if you've got multiple copies, then you can fix the
Yes.
non-conforming copy.
Sure, where fix probably means keeping an additional copy that claims to be the correct one. I think a neat thing about the lock software is it doesn't contain the word delete anywhere. So it means then you can add another version.
Well, the idea, though, is if you have 20 copies scattered all over the place, and one of those 20 copies all of a sudden
That's right.
and so as time goes on and people change through time,
Right. So two comments about that. One is that the success of Bitcoin, I think, has made much more current the idea of using hash trees to do very fast comparisons for large data sets. So I'm not sure that it's a new technique, but it might be something that is much more familiar to people who are designing systems, that we don't have to compare everything. We need a smart data structure that lets us do those comparisons very efficiently. That's one piece. But another piece is that, going back to the threat model, the Locke's threat model includes the idea that your nodes are actually lying and are trying to corrupt the system. And in that instance, you might not be interested in their report about what their hash is. You might want them to prove that they still have the data. And so you might send a challenge that would require them to have an unknown piece so they can't prep for something that they don't have. And so I don't know quite how you marry the efficient data structures to the challenge model. I suspect there's some computer science answer to that. But that is a piece that will mean that you can't just compare a root hash and have the right answer.
Yeah, but and when I think about this, I mean, I have people talk to me about the large digital collections we have and say, that's kind of safe. One of those 20 copies of a because the library, whereas if you've got a robust system like Locke system, the kind of thing, if one of those 20 copies
No, that's true, but another difference between digital and print in terms of strategy is there's kind of the idea of benign neglect, that if you have a lot of print copies and everyone forgets they exist, that probably means you still have them later. If you have a lot of digital copies and everyone forgets they exist, that may well mean that they're all gone later. So that the strategy you're talking about, when we go down to 19, we'll go back up to 20, that presumes a we that's continuous through the time that we're interested in preserving, which I hope for. I think we need it. But it still puts us on kind of a weaker ground than if we had our 20 copies that will each, we think, preserve indefinitely as long as no one touches them.
Yeah, institutionally.
Mm-hmm. So I see it as kind of strengths and weaknesses that, and kind of where we remain on uncertain footing. Maybe digital is stronger than print, but it's untested.
Yeah, but not hopeless.
Mm-hmm. Which is where I part ways with David Rosenthal, incidentally.
Yeah, I mean that's the one thing I like to talk about with people, because lots of stories of experiments. Are going to succeed.
I agree.
And, the ways that success can happen.
So, how does that equation change, do you think, if, like us, you're just looking at current laws, you're looking at laws that affect people's lives today and making that accessible and understandable, as opposed to saving a historical record of the law? So, well, we haven't thought very much about how the data is going to look in about 50 years, because primarily until this point, we've concerned ourselves with accessing current law and making it available and understandable. And so as I was saying, we have not, how does your thinking about saving collections and saving collections change if you're not concerned about preserving like a historical record, what was the law in, say, 1920, but you're concerned with how do I make sure there's always an open channel to publishing current law?
I'm not sure if this addresses what you're saying. Actually talking about, so in the case of case law, the historical record builds itself.
Right.
As you're collecting.
Right.
Quite frankly, when I do my methodology for doing that is actually never
Goes away.
because part of the key to the database. And so when you look up a New Jersey code and that's going to go on forever. Maybe.
I think one of
As long
the,
as I'm not, you know.
by then hopefully we'll have a separate copy in our locks network that you can't touch.
Yeah.
You know, trying to work on a little succession.
One of the ideas that I've definitely adopted from the library folks coming in as an attorney and programmer is the notion that you always have to know whether you're talking about access or preservation and how those
exactly.
interact.
Right.
And hopefully they become totally orthogonal. You can solve each of them separately. Sometimes it's cheaper to solve them together, and then you have to think multidimensionally, and that gets really hard. I think if you can be in a place where you're just about access, then the mode of thought becomes more entrepreneurial. You can kind of be focused on the, like, how do we get an edge today in getting access to more people, getting more enthusiasm, getting more support for growing it out. If you also have to say we're totally committed to long-term preservation, then you have to, on the entrepreneurial side, draw people towards how do you think more about our commitment to the future.
Right.
You know, we can't always do the thing that is going to get us the most users right now.
And I would say up until this point, access has been the biggest problem. So it's the problem that we've focused on almost exclusively. Steps towards that it's been access that we've worried about.
The entrepreneurial side, I think, has a lot of strength in the library world. Kind of depending who you're talking to, I'll say think more about one or think more about the other. Because, for example, with Perma, the strategy for preserving websites so far for courts has been like, we'll do nothing. And then when you say, what are you doing for it? They'll say, oh, we'll start printing them out and keeping them on our desk. And you're like, wow, well, anything we do will be helpful at that point, you know, like let's start doing something.
Right.
And there's a lot of value to like, let's do a thing and then we'll figure out how to do the right thing. I struggle with calibrating that balance of like, how much do we do the right thing and how much do we do something? Thanks, Alan.
Thank you.
Is that what you were talking about?
Yes, and then I just, otherwise, other stuff I would not, but I didn't see. Like dynamics of transition. But I cannot ask that if I didn't.
It's all sitting in easy backup somewhere.
I was in
AWS. But we've not
it, it adds a significant layer of complexity to the system. So it's not something that you just take on right. But it is very important to do for the long run.
How big do you think that AWS backup is? Like, should we have a copy of it?
I don't know exactly, but I think Nick finished the complete backup. And he took over. When he was done, because we had several servers and several hard drives and everything. So we've
As a group.
systematically, they've been working through just they do have also local backup, but it's much smaller.
I need a natural thing that was on our last night.
Right.
That might affect how much space.
It's in hundreds of gigs. That's not much by, yeah, by your standards.
Well, even then, at our state, we're not much by, you know.
It never gets
the
turned
big
off.
technical security. And that's sort of, that's one of the things that helps us do that. Because they have a copy of it, which is, I mean, it's true.
Baby stepping their way towards. Towards
Well, the people that I talk to
doing stuff.
really more concerned about is the ally. Even it can be a source of package. Is an organization called the Free
Fast, I'm trying to get this.
Coalition of all the legal information. What every old they're citing to. Years now. Yeah. So they as a librarian, we're concerned and we want a copy, right? So that would serve me so well. Well, I mean, I buy books all the time. I pay for database access to other secondary sources, all kinds of things. Offer me a copy that I can own, even if I need a copy back. You know, reasonable terms. As a librarian, that would be where